So this marks the beginning of my reading and commentary on chapter 19 of the Proverbs. So let's begin. Better is the poor that walketh in his integrity than he that is perverse in his lips and is a fool. Also, that the soul be without knowledge, it is not good. And he that hasteth with his feet sinneth. The foolishness of man perverts his way, and his heart frets against the Lord. Wealth makes many friends, but the poor is separated from his neighbor. A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall not escape. Many will entreat the favor of the prince, and every man is a friend to him that gives gifts. All the brethren of the poor do hate him. How much more do his friends go far from him? He pursues them with words, yet they are wanting to him. He that gets wisdom loves his own soul. He that keeps understanding shall find good. A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall perish. Delight is not seemingly for a fool, much less for a servant to have rule over princes. The discretion of a man deferreth his anger, and it is his glory to pass over a transgression. The king's wrath is as the roaring lion, but his favor is as dew upon the grass. A foolish son is the calamity of his father, and the contentions of a wife are a continual dropping. House and riches are the inheritance of fathers, and a prudent wife is from the Lord. Slothfulness casteth into a deep sleep, and an idle soul shall suffer hunger. He that keeps the commandment keeps his own soul, but he that despises his ways shall die. He that has pity upon the poor lendeth unto the Lord, and that which he has given will he pay him again. Chasten your son while there is hope, and let not your soul spare for his crying. A man of great wrath shall suffer punishment, for if you deliver him, yet you must do it again. Hear counsel, and receive instruction, that you may be wise in your latter end. There are many devices in a man's heart, nevertheless the counsel of the Lord that shall stand. The desire of a man is his kindness, and a poor man is better than a liar. The fear of the Lord tends to life, and he that has it shall abide satisfied. He shall not be visited with evil. A slothful man hides his hand in his bosom, and will not so much as bring it to his mouth again. Smite a scorner, and the simple will beware. And reprove one that has understanding, and he will understand knowledge. He that wastes his father, and chasteneth away his mother, is a son that causeth shame, and bringeth reproach. Cease, my son, to hear the instruction that causes to err from the words of knowledge. An ungodly witness scorneth judgment, and the mouth of the wicked devoureth iniquity. Judgments are prepared for scorners, and stripes for the back of fools. Okay, so we've got that read and behind us. Now the question is, how should we start this chapter? I think we should start it with a reflection. There are a few things on my mind, a few things that I thought of when I was reading those verses. at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'll say this again. In many episodes I've talked about the nature of the Proverbs as I see them, that they are not in totality a declaration, although many may appear to be declarative, in which they are to a degree. But we have been instructed in prudence, we have been instructed in discernment. We have explored the topics of wisdom, of understanding, of knowledge, some of which these verses touch on again. And I think sometimes it is difficult to understand the nature of nestedness. That when something is encapsulated within something else, it's contextual to a degree, but related. We are also considering levels here. I've been talking a lot about levels of transcendence, an analogy that I've been using as a staircase, the other one being the mountain. A staircase is good because it's easy to see the levels. A mountain is good because we can see our pursuit, the path ahead of us, a wide base, and then it narrows towards the peak. At the peak we have that divine logos, which we are all trying to orient ourselves around. That divine logos is understanding, it is truth, it is intelligibility itself, it is God. There are many things on that peak that we ought to be oriented towards, and upon that journey we find exactly what we should be sacrificing to reach that peak. And it's not a simple journey. It is not a journey that is laid out before us. We can listen to those who have come before us, certainly, as those who have written these proverbs, and take their advice and try for a deeper understanding and a richer life. The next thing I would like to say, I suppose, is somewhat of an extension of what I've been saying in relation to the illustration of the mountain. Well, I'll pause there and then I'll come back into it from a side angle. So bookmark the mountain illustration. I was watching a video. I used to watch a lot of Christopher Hitchens videos and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and the new atheist rationalist types. And I was watching, sort of sad, but I was watching Christopher Hitchens' last known public appearance before his death. He died of cancer. Christopher Hitchens was famously known as an atheist and a fighter against dogmatism, religious fundamentalism. And the irony is he himself was quite a fundamentalist in his own views. And although I no longer really hold the same views as Hitchens, I'm not, although I was never truly an atheist, I was more of an agnostic. I still respect his intellect and many of his insights. But the reason that I bring this up is because of the nature of, I don't necessarily want to say dogmatism, because if we were to design a proverb around dogmatism, there would be two sides to that coin, the same as with fundamentalism. We could say the same of perennialism or principalism, whatever. I mean, it's taking an understanding of some fundamental principle, some supporting device. Perhaps it could be a word, it could be a material thing, whatever. This thing is constant in our experience. That if something is fundamental, that it is a principle, it has a load-bearing capacity to it. And we often get in trouble relying too heavily on one principle or another without recognizing the relation between principles and also the context in which we see them. And I think in relation to this, that new atheistic movement, they had a lot of good things to say. There's a lot of truth in what they had to say. They correctly identified, I think, a type of dogmatism that went off the rails. They identified foolishness. They identified tyranny. They themselves seemingly became the pious of a generation. And of course, this is the great irony, that the pious would be the ones who reject God. And so as I re-enter this analogy of the mountain, I think, part of our experience walking up that mountain towards that peak, towards that divine house or resting place, we always have to be discerning. That's such a good word, discerning. Judicious is another word I could use. But going along with the meaning of this word, we must be excellent. We must be fit in discernment. We must be capable and able to recognize and to perceive what is around us, where we might have taken a misstep. Self-reflection, I think, is a part of this discerning nature, the discerning man. The path of righteousness is blocked to all that do not possess that quality of discernment and humility. It allows us to understand and to identify the way that the spirits move. One of the spirits that interests me is the spirit of liberty, and conversely, the spirit of tyranny. And of course, we can move up or down in that hierarchy of principalities, but it is quite an easy thing, I think, to get caught up in a dogmatism that is false, a dogmatism that is convenient, safe, comforting. The journey and the pursuit in life is anything but safe and comforting. Now, that's not to say that safety and comfort are bad, because they certainly will accompany us along our way. But I say, in the spirit of discernment, that if we are to confine ourselves to comfort, or to confine ourselves to safety, and do not take risk, do not expose ourselves to harsh conditions, then we will surely become dogmatic in the negative sense. Our principles will be weak. We will be blinded by our own understanding, or perceived understanding. And transcendence, I think, as a matter of fact, requires sacrifices. Sometimes certain sacrifices are easier than others. Sometimes it's just something that is unseen, and once it is seen, poof, give it up and move up. In other cases, in cases of misplaced dogmatism or poorly recognized principles, a sacrifice, especially in the case of denial, is much more difficult. It's like ripping something away from the self that has been sort of integrated into the self. It's killing part of the self. And I think some people, I suppose I don't have to say it, but I mean it's fairly obvious. I think perhaps some people that struggle with this to such a degree eventually end up taking their lives because of this sort of predicament. The predicament that transcendence requires. That it requires a certain sacrifice. Now, of course, it's not the only reason that people take their own lives, but I think it's one of the possibilities that can lead somebody there. And I've seen it myself in my own experience. And it's a difficult thing to rip that thing outside of yourself, away from yourself, to give it up, to place it on that altar. And yet I used to wonder why the ancient peoples used to sacrifice animals. There's still a lot of mysterious things, certainly, about the ancient peoples, but some of the things that, after going through certain experiences and reading the books of the ancient peoples, it starts to make more sense why they did things the way they had done them. And it's interesting, again, as a matter of discernment, how these sorts of practices wouldn't make sense to us today. And yet other practices do. Again, it goes back to Herodotus, that custom is the king of all men. So let's start with verse 1 here, chapter 19. This is a fairly long chapter compared to chapter 18. And to be completely honest, I'm looking forward to moving into the book of Ecclesiastes, but I have quite a few chapters left. I think maybe 12 chapters or so. And, well, in any case, might as well get started. Verse 1. Better is the poor that walketh in his integrity than he that is perverse in his lips and is a fool. Now, something that I've said often about the Proverbs is that it's sort of, well, I haven't said this specifically, but now that I think about it, might as well extend the analogy or extend the thought. I have a commentary on Cratylus, the Platonic dialogue. Now, who knows if my interpretation is correct, but just like the Proverbs, the Platonic dialogues take you on this journey. And the journey is participatory to a degree, less so than I would say the Proverbs, but they offer you this self-reflective and creative outlet upon which you can build and ruminate in their discussion. Now, Cratylus is about the etymology of words, the origin of words, the meaning that is within the words that we use in language. And of these words, how they construct our reality, or how we use them to represent our reality. And the Proverbs, I think, has a very similar aim, or perhaps my interpretation has led me in that direction, because it's impossible to understand the Proverbs without exploring the meaning of words. Now, I've spoken of poor before. The first half of this verse again, better is the poor that walks in his integrity. Now, of the poor, I have expanded that to beyond the material, to be beyond just perhaps a social class. But a person can be poor in all sorts of areas, facets. One can be poor of mind, poor of heart, poor of spirit, poor of soul, poor of material goods, poor of social standing, poor of loving and close relationships, poor of strong business relations, whatever. Poverty is not restricted to one realm. Now, of course, contextual cues may indicate and point us in a direction of what type of poverty we're talking about. But that quality of lacking that we can say of the poor and of the impoverished is quite expansive. Better is the poor that walketh in his integrity than he that is perverse in his lips and is a fool. So again, that second half of that verse, than he that is perverse in his lips and is a fool. Now what's interesting here is, perhaps one would expect that this verse might go something like this. Better is the poor that walketh in his integrity than the rich that is perverse in his lips and is a fool. And another thing I would have to say here is that I have to be careful about translation. This is another level of the annoying reality that we find ourselves in. At the last verse of the last chapter, I had correctly interpreted a verse, but I had also left room because of some inconsistency that I saw. Or perhaps it's not an inconsistency, but a room that's left open. Now, it was primarily left open by the translation. Other translations into English were fairly consistent. And I ended up closing that one route that ended up being sort of a positive route, positive interpretation. Most of them had a context that was different. Perhaps I could say negative, but in the context of the whole verse, it wasn't quite negative, just in that small segment. But nonetheless, I have to be careful about my interpretation of this first verse, because it's entirely possible that it is trying to refer and give us contextual cues to the poor and rich in this social class. But I will say that if it is saying, and that it is intended to mean as it means here, I think there's more room to play with. I think there's some greater understanding that can be drawn from this if it doesn't restrict poor to its opposite, to rich, in the sense of the material. But even in that case, perhaps, we wouldn't have to interpret it as material. And perhaps I could say that even in the sense that even if contextual cues were there, it would certainly be an interesting exercise nonetheless to explore the expansiveness of the word poor or rich in the context of the verse. So, okay, having said all of that, better is the poor that walketh in his integrity than he that is perverse in his lips and is a fool. So let's keep in mind this expansiveness of the word poor. Now, I haven't done this exercise in a while, but better is an interesting distinction in and of itself. For what does it mean to be better than? We are making a demarcation between one thing and another, that this is above something else. it's better than. We could say it's more true than. What does it mean to say more true? Perhaps one is true and one is false. But the true place that I'd like to start here is the walking in integrity. Now let's imagine that these Proverbs are a master artist, an artist that we have the pleasure from learning from. Now this artist is standing by us. They are giving a prompt by which we are instructed to paint on a blank canvas. So how does this integrity appear to us? What form does it take? Starting with a definition, integrity is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, moral uprightness, the state of being whole and undivided, the condition of being unified, unimpaired, or sound in construction, internal consistency or lack of corruption. So let me try and make this a bit more vivid. Strong principles, upright, whole, something that is undivided, unimpaired, unified. Now surely this is truthfulness. It is what is considered to be right. And the spirit of liberty is here among our conception. What we are liberated from, or rather I should say what those with integrity are liberated from, is deceit, untruthfulness, and insincerity. The spirit of liberty shows itself in this instance. There is nothing here that is amiss. Everything is laid bare. Now, in some sense, what we are saying is to walk in a degree of openness, but in a degree of openness such that that principle binds us. We walk freely insofar as we are restricted by that which is true. We walk freely with respect to everything that would attempt to dissuade us, to pervert us, to tempt us. Of integrity comes to mind the word integral. Integral meaning necessary to make a whole complete, essential, or fundamental. Now let's reflect for a moment on making the whole complete. Now what exactly is this whole? What is it referring to? Again, it's one of these terms I think that can be applied to many different situations, many different scenarios. But what is meaningful to us here? In what way do we desire this wholeness? This wholeness of mind, wholeness of body, wholeness of spirit, of soul, of being, of connectedness. For if these things are partial, we are lacking. We are lacking we can say, I suppose, in a fundamental sense. We risk instability. But these terms, although they are foundational, they lack concrete, at least at this moment, they lack the proper landing place in the world, that they are not integrated into an experience. Now I think this interpretation, as far as I have interpreted it, it can be applied to many different experiences. But I have to wonder, as I reflect on this, how exactly in my life has this played out? Many of the principles I hold, or I would say that we hold, I think, are beneath the surface. Perhaps it is a testament to those who are pious, to those who walk in integrity, to perhaps understand their principles a little bit more clearly than those who have some implicit way of going about their lives and of orienting themselves to something. There are many things in life that are left unsaid, and it's not necessary for them to be said. I think of a family structure, a family unit in which true love is involved. When conflict occurs, it's not such that there is the worry that the family unit itself will dissolve because that underlying substrate of love, that bondedness. But there is usually, in many families, not moments of explicit explication of how the various family members and their relationships to one another develop into and are realized as foundational pillars or principles of a family. Now, perhaps it wouldn't be an unproductive exercise to do so. Perhaps it would strengthen a family. Perhaps it would create a rift. It's hard to say, really. But I think the main point here is that it's not necessary for everything in life to be made explicit, for everything to be analyzed. Because whether we like it or not, if something is undiscovered and yet it is true, it is still acting in the world and acting upon us. There are certain situations under which, if we are to realize them and we are to analyze them, we are to discover them, it really has no bearing and it makes no difference. Now, perhaps for the prudent, it is useful to recognize and to analyze these principles such that we can amend, such that we can improve upon. In such productive instances, I think that this is all well and good. But again, in some cases, altogether not necessary. Because the process of making something known and bringing it to the surface, that process has certain benefits to it. Perhaps it has certain negatives to it. Perhaps what is brought to the surface isn't quite what one thought was beneath the surface, and what they were relying on, what they believed, was not a true representation, and that can lead to some difficulty. But as our experiences, and as I continue here with this analogy of the family structure and unit, as the experience of family life continues, as the interactions between people are continued and shared, and we grow through life, and hopefully we maintain those strong relations, what lies beneath the surface certainly will be affected. But it is able to be maintained without that level of analysis. So what have I said so far, and why is this important to walking in integrity? Well, I think the point of that was to shed light on the relationship between man's understanding of the fundamental principles that govern his life and his relationships, and of those principles that are beneath his ready awareness and perhaps immediate memory and recall. That this process of integration can be both something that is, well, let me rewind. This process of integration takes place whether we like it or not. And I think the same is true of the process of disintegration. That is, of moving together to form a whole and to move away from into disunity. These processes can occur beyond our awareness. We may be walking in integrity without consciously understanding if we are behaving in such a way that we are uniting, that we are moving pieces together, such that we afford ourselves the opportunity for transcendence. And by transcendence, what do I mean? From the transcendence from the Latin transcendere, which means to climb over or to climb beyond. That prefix meaning across. Prefix is trans, across, or beyond. That verb, scandere, meaning to climb. So to move above, to climb across, to move across. The literal interpretation here of this word brings to the image a staircase, this heavenly staircase. And by transcendence, we are moving beyond, we are moving up and beyond the previous level. But the previous level of what? Of understanding. I think transcendence involves more than just understanding. It involves a lot of different things. I think it's beyond the individual to a degree. But I think that within this process of transcendence involves this integrity, this integral, this becoming whole. And perhaps we can further this explanation by thinking about this ascent on the staircase. The forces required, the sacrifices that's required to move us up and above the current level that we are at. It requires the essential. It requires the fundamental. It is those principles upon which we recognize in a new context or in a new relationship to another. And this brings to mind a conversation that I was having with a friend of mine the other day about this crisis in Israel, the war between Israel and Palestine. And there's a lot of emotion. And the emotion comes from myself, the emotion comes from my friend. But as I've been reading the Proverbs, I have become more tempered, I think, in my approach to the conflict and more committed to resolve in the integral sense, resolve meaning to bring some problem to a conclusion and then reintegrate it into something that is more holistic, that allows us to participate with each other rather than separate us. This reintegration gives us perspective, and the whole way about this provides us with a procedure to come together. A procedure through which we can accomplish greater things. Not just solve a problem, but reintegrate it and then work together towards some higher understanding. And it requires that honesty, that truthfulness, that liberation from deceit. It requires humility, the a degree of openness such that one is able to listen, to truly hear what somebody else has to say, to take something into consideration, and to honestly consider something for its worth in and of itself, without superficial distinction. Now, of course, it's a great temptation of man to fall into a combative sort of disposition, even in or perhaps I should say, especially in our moments of fatigue, where we are more likely to be impulsive and quick to judgment, and of little patience. Better is the poor that walketh in his integrity than he that is perverse in his lips and is a fool. Now, of this poor person, it's interesting. It's likely that this verse is implying a person of poor material wealth or of poor social standing. But it's difficult to imagine that this person would be poor in this way for long if they walked in that integrity long enough. Of course, the simple may remain in a state of poverty, of material poverty, and it may not bother them one bit, and it ought not to. But surely it would be difficult to make the case that these people, that if they truly do walk in integrity, that they walk to make things whole, they walk such that they are concerned with the transcendence of themselves, of their being, of their soul, and of that being of those around them. Now, of the perverse, this is essentially the opposite of those who are integral, who have that integrity. The perverse is this turning away from a type of disintegration. The lips that wish to separate, that wish to divide, that wish to turn against. Or to turn away from those principles that are right. And as a fool, this is of somebody's understanding of their relationship to those truthful principles, but their understanding is so unfortunately dull, perhaps, or antagonistic because of some selfish worry or some desire for self-preservation, that there is a denial of that which is. And within that denial comes a lot of suffering. And certainly this is why we start the verse with better. Because that integration and that transcendence is better than the suffering that occurs because of the denial of that which is. Also, that the soul be without knowledge. It is not good. And he that hasteth with his feet sinneth. So let us begin with the self. Now, defining the self is no easy matter, especially since this verse is not necessarily composed in such a way that we are to ponder the true nature of the soul. Here is it has soul as a secondary word. But nonetheless, any bit of information is good information. And I am reminded of a thought when I see this. As my eyes glance across the page onto the previous page, I see another verse in which the word soul is contained. This would be chapter 16, verse 24. Pleasant words are as a honeycomb, sweet to the soul, and health to the bones. Now, the reason I mention this is not to go into that verse in particular, but rather to reflect on the fact that that verse 24, has a small piece of something of the soul that we can use in our conception and identification of the soul. Now, no doubt memory will fail us, will fail me, and there surely are many instances in the Proverbs in which the soul has been mentioned, and there will be many to come in which the soul will be mentioned. The point here is that whenever we see the word soul, no matter how insignificant the verse is at helping us understand the soul, we should pay attention, because the soul is used in a particular context. If it is used, then we can find some relation to it. If we can find a relation to it, perhaps we can find it within this heavenly sphere. Generally, I've been conceiving the soul as this fundamental part of man. It is not a physical thing, it is amaterial. Perhaps we can say the material world offers up its supports in order to hold up the amaterial thing that we conceptualize, that I conceptualize as the soul. Moreover, from that, the soul I have been defining further as something that is the center point of our being. It is that logos of the individual. It is that thing that is embodied. It is the thing by which the spirit emanates. It is the thing that is identified by those who love us most. That the soul be without knowledge is not good. And so what does it mean for the soul to have knowledge? I won't bother with going into what is knowledge. Again, I've spent many episodes talking about this sort of thing. On my channel there is a commentary on Euthyphro, which is a Platonic dialogue on just that matter. Well, I suppose we can ask the question, is the soul the same thing as the mind? Is the mind the same thing as the brain? In the latter instance, I don't think the mind is the same thing as the brain. Again, the brain is the underlying material structure upon which the mind exists. The mind, through its complex morphology and its complex interaction, all of its parallel processing, its different areas responsible for slightly different things, and yet, again, paralleled to some degree, redundant perhaps to a degree. But if we were to go through all of the nitty-gritty details, and we were to explain away every connection. If we were to understand why we feel a certain way when something happens, by looking perhaps at an illustration of the activity in the brain, if we were to thoroughly identify all of the most minute of places by which the blood vessels carry blood and take blood away, if we were to understand the interaction and the behavior of the cells, all of the various neurotransmitters and the release thereof by the neurons, and the relationships between the neurons, we at best, I think, could do two things. We can project, we can predict what might happen next, given a certain set of circumstances, or we can look at an image, and for however long we choose, we can examine that image and hypothesize about the going-ons. And perhaps a third would be some visualization with some tool, some live stream of activity of the brain. But surely it would be a much less resolute type of experience than that of some other methods. This way of understanding would not tell us, the mind. It would not afford us the experience of the person. It would tell us nothing of the heavenly things. It would tell us nothing of the heart, nothing of the interaction between this complex organism and another one of these complex organisms. Much like the mind and its comparison to the brain, its purely material substructure, I'm not entirely sure that I can make the equivalence between that mind and the soul. But of course, after all, it's a matter of language, isn't it? And there are many frustrations with language and its limits. For I can weasel my way into some definition, find some equivalency. Of course, I'd be forced to change it if it's too contrary to that of the prevailing understanding. But in what way does the soul differ from the mind, if it's not exactly the same? Surely it includes elements. The mind is something that includes the symbol of the heart. It includes most of the things that we have been discussing thus far. It includes the capacity for much, for humility, for wisdom, for trust, for prudence, for learning, understanding, the ability to understand and use tools. It is afforded the ability to be good, to be just, to be righteous, to be wicked, to be foolish, to be evil. It can be pacified. It can be angered. It could be disintegrated. It can be reconstituted. It can transcend, it can descend, it can sacrifice, it can give, it can take, it can rise and it can fall. Many interesting conceptions that the mind is capable of, even though it does not directly do many of these things in the material world. That substrate, that heavenly substrate upon which it is afforded its experience, is certainly the home of the soul. And I think to the degree that I am able to separate the mind from the soul, I think it has to do with a fundamental axiom. Whereas we can consider mind as something that is perhaps more Platonic, something that exists as a concept, an idea, some form, not an ideal, but a form, separate from its material understructure. One needs not religion to be able to understand the difference between the two. Emergence is not a far-flung idea to most minds. However, assuming that we exist within a substrate of intelligibility, that would be one of these axioms, assuming that there is some source through which we are allowed to experience in the way that we do. And to a lesser degree, perhaps we can say of the experience of any living organism that has the ability to perceive and act, that it has the ability to dance along that order of the universe, that order that it finds in its own experience. We have found ourselves with a unique ability compared to the things, the organisms around us, through our various interconnected parts, to abstract ourselves, to think, to rationalize, and to organize, or at least to organize within our minds the structure of the world that we are able to perceive. And when I say the world that we are able to perceive, that ability is dependent upon our makeup, perhaps. It's dependent upon the material substrate that we have found ourselves plugged into. Now, of course, that's another analogy to that fundamental axiom that we are the light that we perceive, that light of the conscious mind, that thing that powers the soul of man, comes from some generator, it comes from some power plant, we can say. It comes from a soulful power plant. And if we assume this axiom, we are left with a bizarre view, maybe not view, but a bizarre reality. A lot of untied ends. A lot of bizarre situations to think about. There are many different experiences among men. Within the average, certainly. Within the average, there's not too much that is frightening. Of course, we can think about all the ways that man can find themselves or himself in a perverse state of being, state of mind, that he cannot see beyond. But as we move away, and I think this is particularly interesting to think about, not so much in the direction of those beyond the average that are able to experience life more richly, that their hardware is much more effective at identifying patterns, it's much quicker, perhaps it's more disciplined. This sort of thing is interesting, so much as a basketball player, a player in the NFL, is interesting compared to the average individual. But if we go in the other direction, if we go in the direction of unfortunate circumstances, perhaps in which that hardware is not sufficient to see the world as the average sees it, perhaps it is partial, perhaps much of it is missing. Now, even among the average, we experience this sort of unfortunate reality, again, compared to the standard, the average man, with his average intellectual ability, with his average physical ability. But we are primarily concerned about that perceptual sphere, so we can say intellectual. As man finds himself both in a state of infancy and in a state of old age, he will experience this coming and going of what he had previously known, perhaps through disease of the mind, or general degradation, the slowing down of the physical substrate upon which he is able to experience. And again, among all of those who have been born into a situation with congenital defects, where their experience of the world is perhaps akin to certain other species, certain other mammals, that it doesn't quite reach the human experience, the average human experience. And again, we can jump off the human ship altogether and imagine all the various organisms that have complex nervous systems and brains, this organization of neurons through which they are able to interact in this weird material world with all the different material substrates. It's also confusing. I have to wonder, why so partial? Certainly it's a self-centered view. As I say, as I ask, why is everything so partial? Well, partial relative to us, partial relative to that perception that is at the top, at the known top of intellectual, of perceptual, perhaps not perceptual, but intellectual, rational ability. And what if something else was known? What if there was an entire expanse of different creatures, let's say upon the earth, just for the sake of argument, that were much more intelligent than we are, in ways that we could not perceive of, just as in the way that a deer is unable to perceive the experience of man. Certainly we'd be able to understand them better than a deer would be able to understand them. But there would be certain fundamental ways in which we would be unable to appreciate their experience. And they too, with all of their prowess and their intellectual might, they too are limited compared to that source, that fundamental, intelligible sphere, the peak of that mountain. And so from the high to the low, this axiom must exist. And the question is, well, how exactly do the organisms, and perhaps even the material structure that the organisms perceive, how are they related to that thing? Now, in such situations, my mind goes directly to surrealist art. Perhaps it's a bit of an antagonistic form, but it is weird, and I think in that weirdness I find some solace. Because in my mind, I think a bit of this surreal experience. I think of something that is all white. I think of something that is all black. And just like if we were to if man was to find himself thrown into the world, into some world that is created by the thing that is all white. So white in this case is an illustration of this luminousness, this light, this perception, ability to perceive, awareness. And upon that black or dark surface, the white from perhaps an overly saturated paintbrush, the paint that is white drips from this paintbrush onto that black canvas. Now, this isn't necessarily making a surrealist art, but it is interesting to watch and to see, perhaps, the white drip down that black canvas, turning portions of it white. Some of those droplets find themselves farther down that canvas than others, because they are more full of that paint. There's more material there for it to ride the wave of gravity down the canvas. There are other droplets that are more superficial. They don't penetrate quite as deep into that darkness. Now I think I'm approaching, to some degree, what it means for the soul to have knowledge. And this verse is particularly to the experience of man, no doubt, because within his will he is able to expand that droplet. He's able to find himself inundated, impregnated, I think is a better word for it, with more of that paint, for which he is that droplet. And he is able to roll farther down that canvas. The more he knows, the more that soul of his is filled with that paint. That soul is sort of that surface tension of the liquid that holds everything in. Now, perhaps what makes it surreal, if I had to commit to making this a surreal piece of art, upon each individual droplet, I can paint an entire experience an entire life lived. And what's interesting, perhaps it's interesting, perhaps it's not, how exactly would that experience be illustrated? How would it be seen? What would be necessary to see it? Because certainly everything is coming from that which is outside of the canvas. There is no thing outside of the canvas other than the intelligible sphere, that centralized point, the origin of all of that paint. And to think of it as an observer is a bit strange. Because as a matter of fact, as long as that paint penetrates a degree of that canvas, the entirety of that, perhaps the form of the paint itself, again to use another Platonic thing, Platonic idea, is, what would I say, aware. That paint surrounds that entire canvas. There's just a blank canvas that exists in a room of white. Itself is integrated into the room, not separate, perhaps not raised above. It's encapsulated within. And it's interesting, why would such an awareness create something for which it could penetrate? For which it could penetrate in such a bizarrely magnificent, chaotic at times, scary thing. And why is it so specific? Why does it have the order that it has? Why is it good? Why is it good that the soul has knowledge? It's good insofar as the known, the aware, penetrates that which is within it that seems to be unknown. It's as if, to use another illustration, within a room, a light has been turned on, and there are a few shadows in the room for whatever reason. Perhaps they're well, to stay consistent with the analogy, the lamp is insufficient to cover the entire room with the degree of luminosity that it has at certain points. Perhaps maybe directly under it. I'm looking at a lamp that's in front of me. The lampshade is, of course, obscuring the brightness of that light bulb so it doesn't blind me. But there's an opening above the shade and below, so that gives it an interesting pattern, but again, both above and below, where the light is able to shine most brightly. But around the periphery, of course, the light permeates the room, but against the wall, there's quite an indication that the source of that light is over there. One has to wonder What is that source of light? Is it within something else? Well, we've been discussing the fractal nature of reality. The question is, at what point does that fractal end? The sort of Russian doll scenario. Is there an end to the Russian dolls? Or is it just experience after experience? Surely there's an end if one is to believe in a central point. If not, it would make us a polytheist. To think of our central point as one central point of many other central points that perhaps are interacting with the central point above them. But even if it was purely above them and not just a bunch of different central points in a room somewhere, looking in on our reality, playing a game of dice, it would scale all the way up to that central point. At some point it's impossible to observe, I think. Or at least the illustration maintains itself at the level that it can, that man can perceive. That there is something that surrounds some seemingly chaotic, I wouldn't say void, but created world in which there are beings that are part of that world, that their awareness of that world is well beyond the thing that created it, or well below the thing that created it. And it is, as it says in Genesis, "But there went up a mist from the earth, and watered the whole face of the ground. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul." Now I think what's interesting about man and his living soul as an extension of God, as an extension of the image of God, let's say, I think man does have the ability to dampen. I think he has ability, just as God has the ability to create that black canvas, or that dark canvas, within his intelligible sphere. Man certainly has the ability to kill himself if he desires. He can wipe himself off of that canvas. And that white paint, that intelligibility that he is painted over with darkness. And so, certainly, I think we can see that the soul, with knowledge, is a good thing. The soul with knowledge has more to offer that substrate, that blank canvas. It has the ability to fill it in. Now, where goodness comes in, I think it's obvious in the case of that suicide example, but our interaction, our relations are such difficult things. And surely this is why we are prey for that force upon this blank canvas that wishes to prevent that paint from encompassing it, from knowing it. But the irony is, the thing itself is that paint, you know? It can't be that nothingness, if it is to be something. And he that hasteth with his feet sinneth. So one has to wonder what that means. Of course, haste means excessive speed or urgency of movement or action. Now with his feet are the mechanism by which he moves, both in the physical sense but also the embodied sense of the soul. The soul is literally carried through the material world by virtue of his feet. And if we were to extend this to that analogy, that blank canvas, his feet is that willful part of him that explores that darkness, perhaps. Perhaps it's a stretch to say that, but we're exploring nonetheless, so there's no harm in it. And so why would it be a sin to have quick feet in that context? Well, I think it's a warning against the desire, perhaps it can be the desire to do good without proper consideration, without proper discernment. And in the course of our action and our behavior, in the attempt to do good, we actually do the opposite. And because we are moving so quickly, we are not paying attention. We're not being careful. And I was just thinking, this matter of transcendence, if we reintroduce the illustration of the staircase, that every rung of this staircase is a level of transcendence of man or of the individual, and the prerequisite for such a transcendence is sacrifice. It involves some difficulty. Difficulty because not necessarily we need to suffer, but difficulty because we have to pay attention. We have to pay attention to that which is, and attending to something is difficult. It's difficult for a lot of people. It's difficult for me. And I mean truly attending to something. Now, the more we find ourselves in a culture and a tradition that values attentiveness, I think the better off we will be. Now, to go a little bit further with this illustration, this analogy, I was thinking that we seem to be at this point. It's hard to say exactly when the point occurs in history, when some new fundamental paradigm shift occurs. But given the rate of progress, or progress is not the right word, the rate of change that we have experienced, that we have been experiencing since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the rapidity by which we experience these axial events, that pivoting around that central point, seems to it's a bit of a trip to think about. And in relation to this transcendence, going up that staircase, what we find at every level is the manifestation of the old spirits that have come along with us. That perceptual sphere maintains itself no matter how high we walk up that staircase. And it's up to us to recognize the fundamentals, so we can see, no matter what changes about our political structure, an organization, or about our corporate institutions, or about our families, we are still able to identify where love is. We're still able to identify where the divine man, the divine masculine is, where the divine feminine is. We should always be continuing to look at that North Star, that divine logos, the center of that mountain, the peak of that mountain. We should be attending to the spirit of liberty. We should be understanding exactly what we should be sacrificing to and for. And within all of this, or from the verse, I hear all of this, and he that hasteth with his feet sinneth. The foolishness of man perverteth his way, and his heart fretteth against the Lord. Now of the fool, I think we can say that this person is, to a degree, inattentive, or at least irresponsible in the way they apply their attention. This is a person who acts unwisely. They are imprudent, they are silly. And as I was reading this verse, I thought of my behavior. I thought all of the ways in which my behavior could be considered foolish. And I do have this foolish aspect to me. Perhaps we all do. Who knows? But insofar as interpersonal relations are concerned, from my own experience, I believe my foolishness comes within that package of silliness, we can say. It is a type of, a way of provoking laughter or some response that might enhance the interaction between myself and a coworker or a friend. But it's fundamentally, I think, geared towards this silliness and inattentiveness. The jokes are often left without anything. There is a buildup of a conception of substance, and at the end of it, it reveals nothing beneath. There is also, I think, a common pattern in my joking, my silliness, my foolishness, in which I may insert particular dialogue at a moment where it ought not to be inserted, or that the behavior is so bizarre given the circumstances that there is no choice but to find it ridiculous. And I wonder, first, I wonder if this foolishness, that this behavior, is in and of itself bad, or if there is a redemptive quality to it, insofar as, given that it is embedded within that positive relationship building, then there is this excusable element to it. I think at the end of it, I think that there probably is some negatives to all foolish behavior. But given the context, I think that there are also some positives that are gained from it. Again, at least in terms of my personal experience. But we can go in any number of directions from there. We can unattach this foolish behavior from its context, from its interrelation in a relationship, interpersonal relationship boundary. We could say, okay, it is no longer something that is designed and directed towards the betterment of a relationship, but that it is the behavior of a man or of myself in my natural state, with no alternative motive, nothing behind it. And this state of foolishness, I think, is a rather unfortunate state, because I think there is a degree, perhaps a large degree, to which the individual is unaware of their own foolishness. Unlike my example, where I'm well aware of the foolishness, and it is an attempt to provoke a response. I think there is a type of foolish person, there is a fool, that is unaware of their foolishness. And this is dangerous because of the consequences, obviously. That perversion of his way. And I think it's fairly straightforward to see how inattentiveness can pervert one's path in life if one is unable to focus on something for long enough to establish something that is known in some trajectory for life. Then many things will be disrupted, not only the economic situation, but also the growth and development, the maturation of that person, of that individual. The foolishness of man perverteth his way, and his heart fretteth against the Lord. Now, what I see here in the second half of this verse is selfishness. That is, this fretting, this dreading against what's likely to be judgment, a divine judgment, because of some perceived injustice on the part of the individual. The individual will say, the foolish individual will say, I will not accept this verdict, this judgment, because my behavior is my own. I should be able to behave however unwisely or imprudent as I see fit. And these consequences, I am undeserving of these consequences. And so it is this denial and pride that causes one to remain in their foolishness. It is their pride and their inappropriate valuing of the self that prevents them from seeing beyond, that prevents them from accepting that external criticism such that they can correct their behavior and resolve themselves of that foolishness, and thereby move them back on that path towards righteousness. Wealth makes many friends, but the poor is separated from his neighbor. Now here we have wealth, I think, that is sort of implied as a social, at the top of the social hierarchy, as well as the sort of economic hierarchy. And the poor is at the bottom of that social hierarchy, at the bottom of that economic hierarchy. And I say that because in the first instance, wealth makes many friends. The implication there is the friends that are made through wealth. And if we were to say that if friends are made through wealth of love or ability to self-sacrifice, to offer somebody something, to be caring and to be judicious in their and their counsel of friends. I think this type of wealth is not what we are talking about. Though I will say that if it is this wealth, it would still be true that it makes many friends. I think what we are referring to here is that superficial type of wealth upon which superficial bonds are made. Wealth makes many friends. By extension, the poor is separated from his neighbor. Again, this part of the verse is almost like an extension of some unfortunate situation that befalls the man of wealth in the first instance. That is to say, when man falls in a state of economic destitution, his neighbors, those that are close to him, move away from him because they want nothing to do with him, whereas before they were close to him because they valued his wealth. That superficial wealth. They did not value the human being. They did not value perhaps the finer things that man can offer another man. That being love and friendship. Friendship outside of that superficial distinction of economic prosperity. A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall not escape. This is a verse that we've seen before. So the question is, what is a false witness? Well, we are considering here a person that uses their perception. And in the context of our interpretation of the first and second verse, I think this is particularly important. Because we imagine our place and our role in the perceptual sphere. Again, if we dampen the perspective of the self a little bit and we expand the horizon to the possibility of perceptual experiences, and especially perceptual experiences that are grounded within some large, broader perceptual experience, some unity and source of perceptual experience, full stop. I think we can experience how, if one is to use their experience falsely and report something that they say that they had seen in a way that was contrary to the events that actually took place in a willing manner, it's still bad if it happens in a manner that's mistaken. But in the broad scheme of things, when man perverts the truth and lies, he is effectively reintroducing darkness into that intelligible sphere. He is undoing the process of creation. And as such, he will be punished, because the light in that intelligible sphere is one that is all-encompassing. It understands exactly where the darkness is. A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall not escape. I think I sort of touched on this. That lie is the perversion of that intelligible sphere. It is the undoing of creation. And because it is the undoing of creation, we find ourselves not the creators, but the destroyers of life and of mind, of consciousness. And if the very thing that is set forth like a seed within the earth that has that is to be formed into a tree that buries its roots deep and then emerges above the soil, this is sort of man's and all creatures that possess a degree of how can we say, intuition, consciousness, self-awareness. That is, it is dependent upon these beings, just like a seed in that example, to breach the surface of that soil into that broader perceptual sphere. The separation between that earthly, material, a conscious thing from that of the heavenly, from that of the conscious, from that of the aware. And so those that speak lies will not escape. I mean, they literally will not escape. They will be stuck beneath the surface of that soil. They will not be afforded that opportunity to grow. And it's not necessarily a fire and brimstone situation. It's just the fact of how it's going to be. If there is no attempt to rise above and be beyond, that beyond will not find them. They will be destined to that darkness. Many will entreat the favor of the prince, and every man is a friend to him that giveth gifts. Now, there's a few different ways I think that this verse can be interpreted. In the first instance, I'll say that we have a verse that's similar in structure to that of verse number 4. Wealth makes many friends, but the poor is separated from his neighbor. Again, verse 6, many will entreat the favor of the prince, and every man is a friend to him that giveth gifts. And so here we see, much like that of the wealthy person in the first instance, many people will come to the prince because he has this position of authority. They will entreat, they will ask something of the prince, because he, again, has the authority to grant what is being asked. In the second instance, every man is a friend to him that giveth gifts. I think on the surface, we can say that much like verse number 4, where the wealth makes friends and the poor separates neighbors, we have a superficial distinction here, that this friendship, which is something that ought to be bound within something greater than just bribery or gift giving. And I think we can fiddle with the language a little bit and talk about the nature of a gift, and that the act of giving a gift can be much more than just some material thing. But sticking with the context of this verse, I think that it implies a degree of corruption, or perhaps not corruption at all if it's institutional, it's just the way that things work, that the prince will be more interested in those who take an interest in him. Now, that relationship might be quite superficial, and I think that's the point of the proverb. This is what it's warning us against this type of relationship. That many come to ask favors of another man that is above them in authority. And in order to do so, they have to give him something. They have to sacrifice, much like they sacrifice to God. And I think the danger here is that they treat the prince like a god. Now, from my two interpretations, the one being sort of positive, the other negative, I think the negative context is a little bit more glaring, just given the structure of these two sentences. But the positive also exists, and I think the two exist together. Again, keeping in mind our illustration of the staircase and of what's required of transcendence, you have two opposites. To some degree, their reconciliation is the movement beyond that problem. And to that I would say, and to that I mean, in further detail, that on one hand, we have the positive, that there is something within gift-giving that will lead to some reciprocation. And that is not entirely a negative exchange or interaction with somebody. Now, as we consider the position of the prince and a position of authority over many people, it's easy to see how the gift-giving to this prince is not genuine. It is, again, it's like a bribe. It is not made, it doesn't come from love. The gift probably will be superficial, because if many people entreat the prince, it is unlikely that these many people are going to have the proper relational infrastructure to gain the type of longevity from a relationship, specifically a relationship between a common person and the prince, that we would find in a close friendship that is based on shared experiences, that has mutual trust involved, that has love involved. And so from this, again, we are working on unification between the superficial gift-giving in exchange for favors, and that of genuine gift-giving in the exchange for genuine favors, perhaps. But this transaction, in the positive sense, is more natural, it's more fluid, it is not this for that. We see a this for that, but it is encompassed within an understanding, again, a mutual trust, a shared love, perhaps, a genuine interest. All the brethren of the poor do hate him. How much more do his friends go far from him? He pursues them with words, yet they are wanting to him. Now this is an interesting structure of the words here. All the brethren of the poor do hate him. Now it seems like we are applying a masculine trait to that of the poor, to this form of the poor. All the brethren of the poor do hate him. And so this poor, it's like a form of a man. And all of the people, its brethren, which is another interesting use of the word, these brethren that have some relationship to him, perhaps they're countrymen, Perhaps they are family. Perhaps they are fellow poor people. How much more do his friends go far from him? An interesting question. A question that has certain assumptions built into it. It indicates that the friends have already gone far from him, and the question is, well, how much more do the friends go from him? Because of this poverty, because of their disgust with him, we have to again ask the question about the quality of this friendship. If friends are just made based on the wealth, again, the material wealth of an individual, were they really friends at all? And I sort of have to question language here. Why are we using the word friend? Certainly we should be more judicious in the way that we use our words. But perhaps the word friend is used until one understands that they were mistaken. Perhaps that they believed that they were in a state of friendship with somebody, but in reality, when the cards came due, or in the sense the cards must be revealed, what frightened off what broke the bonds that at one time was considered to be a friendship between one person and another, was that of the face of destitution. And I think we have to be a bit careful about poverty, because even within the material, the socioeconomic sense, it's easy, I think, to attribute certain behaviors, and I think that it's not unreasonable. There are certain patterns of behavior that are consistent with destitution that would cause probably a significant disruption in someone's personal life and their relationships, because their mind changes. They are now interested in things that are more perhaps foundational. Perhaps the mind itself doesn't hold up to the stress of that state of destitution, and it seeks even more destructive behavior in an attempt to quell the anxiety and the despair that is felt by the poverty that they find themselves in. That type of intricacy, it's more reasonable to understand how basic material conditions can affect otherwise strong relationships. However, if we are just considering at face value that if one loses money, or that if they lose the two-bedroom house that they lived in to now living in some run-down apartment complex, or perhaps even a motel, or living in their car, or under a bridge, it's quite a state, quite a change in living conditions. Now, at that face value, assuming that the character of the person has remained the same, that is, remained resolute, I think we could safely say that the catalyst that dissolved their interpersonal relations was the reduction in material living conditions. But it's a good question to ask. How much more do his friends go far from him? Because it's sort of asking, how much more, for what greater reason do they leave this person? Because we can establish the basic, the face value, the loss of material living standards. But then again, we extend into some of the things that I had mentioned that's beyond that. About perhaps the behavior of the individual, of the poor person. But I think there's something else that could be said here of this question: how much more do his friends go far from him? Because it's not as simple as just that abandonment. It is like the moving away from the center point, as if there are these layers of interaction that seem to be damaged because of a change in material living condition. And as the distance increases, we find ourselves in a greater degree of separation, and a ever more fragile bond between people that were once associated or considered themselves to be friends with one another. And if we consider these gradations, perhaps we can imagine something like a gradual distancing, in the sense that perhaps initially somebody that was considered a friend tried to help a person in a rough way. Perhaps they gave him some money, perhaps they gave him some food. Then after a time, the person removes themselves from contact, and perhaps they will maybe make a phone call, see how things are going. A step farther out from that, the phone calls reduce in frequency, perhaps it's a text message or something. Further out from that, a very periodic communication, and after that, absence of communication altogether. Now, what comes to mind here in regard to this separation from some central point is something that we have heard before in the Proverbs, not too frequently, perhaps once or twice, but I think as we have heard it, it has been fairly strategic. And the word that I'm thinking about is the hearth, because the hearth is a center point. It is something, it is a symbol that is beyond its material structure, but also its material structure is important because it provides us with a place in the world in which we can literally center ourselves around. Now, this process of centering is much more than just that physical space. It involves a relation, it involves this commitment, and perhaps many other things. But as I was thinking about this center point, and this experience of disintegration that the poor man experiences when all of his friends leave him, I think about what exactly it means for us to have this unity, to have this hearth, this center point around which we can be confident, that we can place our faith in, that we can comfortably call something that is home. You know, I was listening to a discussion today about liberation, about freedom, and how in the modern day we are concerned with absolute liberation, that we are concerned with liberalism for the sake of liberalism, no matter how far it extends. The constraints are the enemy. And one of the things that I really valued in this conversation was the indication that the constraints are necessary under certain circumstances. And it's not a simple matter to just say that liberation involves the removal of restraints. If this were so, the spirit of liberty would be lost. We would not be able to identify it as something that is real, nor would we be able to abolish slavery. And the reason I say that is because our abolition, our liberation, is always relative to something. Now, eventually, I think that this philosophy of absolute liberation, at the end of it involves leading to man trying to liberate himself from the world, trying to liberate himself from reality, trying to liberate himself from the constraints of truth, which of course he cannot do. And as I think about this further and bring in the symbol of the hearth into this, the hearth is to a degree a restraint. It is something that calls, it is something that binds. It is something, again, around which we establish a home. A home, again, is something that has this restraining element to it. But this restraint in this context is fundamental to our lives, to our well-being, to our sense of belonging, to our feeling connected. And there are many other examples, I think, that I can use, especially in the modern day, to describe and to illuminate how this philosophy of liberation has had negative consequences on the rest of our society and our culture. Moreover, from that, the lack of discernment when it comes to what we ought to restrain ourselves to, or recognize what authority that we are to act under. This lack of discernment has, I think, exacerbated the issue. That even among those, of course this is not everybody, but among those who are not of the class of people that wish to be liberated from fundamental conceptions or identities, there are those that are so impoverished of the old tradition, the old way, that it's difficult to find some useful resistance against that onslaught, that philosophical and cultural revolutionary fervor. And I think, in my case, certainly, I never truly fell into the new atheism, but I felt a sense of wonder at the way in which some of the people of that movement were able to convey themselves, to conduct themselves, to how they spoke, the knowledge that they possess, and I still admire that. Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, these are intellectual people. They have achieved a lot in their lives, and I think they are worthy of respect. But by the same token, their philosophy, I think, if accepted wholehearted, leads to the destruction of that home. Another word for it that was used in the conversation that I heard today is domicide. He pursues them with words, yet they are wanting to him. And so I have this rather strange mind And it comes up with rather strange images. But the image that I see is almost cartoonish. It's a bit bizarre. On one hand, there's a sort of an abstract representation of his prior associations, leaving him behind and moving from him ever farther. And in my mind, there's an abstract representation of this, sort of a black and white plane of this stretching out and away from some central point. In which this abstract representation really has no grounding. It's more principled, perhaps. It's not contextual. But let me ask the question, why is he pursuing? I think it's clear that he is pursuing those who are going from him. He's pursuing them with words. And so he throws his words out to catch them. Perhaps to ask them why. Why do you leave me in this state? What have I done? And the language here is interesting. Yet they are wanting to him. The word that is interesting to me is the word to. It's not yet they are wanting of him. They are not wanting from him. They are wanting to him. As the ball is thrown to me, the car accident happened to me. It didn't happen of me. It didn't happen from me. It didn't happen by me. So it's a very personal way, it seems, to use that word. Yet they are wanting to him. And who are they? Are they the ones that he pursues? Or is he referring to the words? Now, in the first instance, if the people that he is pursuing are wanting in exchange or in response to the words that surely confront these people from moving away because of his state of poverty. And when the words find them, I see them turning around and asking for something. They are wanting. They are lacking of something. And perhaps the reason that they were in a relationship with this person in the first place was because, before their state of poverty, they were able to provide them with something. And when that something had gone, there was no reason to stay. Of course, under the change of circumstance, one is able to see exactly why the relationship ended. Now, there may be more complex situations from this, but we need not go down that path. The relationship ended. I can say that what broke this union was the fact that one party perhaps was secure in their understanding of that unity. Perhaps they thought it was deeper. I think the indication that they felt that their union with another, that their bonding around some point was more fundamental. It was more hearth-like, we can say. And the interesting thing about the hearth in this situation, given the lack of context, I just think about the relationship in general. That is, that it's not really fixed like a family would be fixed around some point in reality, like this hearth, this fireplace, upon which they can all gather, and they can all come home to after work or after school. Close friends surely have similar rituals and places of gathering. But in this situation, I'm imagining just the bare bones, just that relationship. Perhaps they would go over to each other's houses and hang out with each other, but the relationship maintained itself at a purely transactional level, or a superficial level. And this seems to be clear because our poor man is pursuing them after they went from him because of his state of poverty. Now the key, I think, to this verse is just as our poor man's words catches the ear of those who have left him, and as they turn around to face him, it appears they hold out their hands in a manner that is wanting. And the irony is, of course, the poor man is the one that is wanting of a better life, of food, perhaps in extreme cases. And I would have to imagine in this situation, in the context of this time, this poverty was probably fairly crippling. It must have reduced a man to a terrible state of destitution and physical, probably rapid physical deterioration, poor health, dirty skin, ripped clothes. And again, the irony is that these people who were at once friends with him now reach out as if they are the poor person. And they are asking for something in a strange way, and I'm not quite sure why one would do this. And I would like to find some conclusion here that is beyond a particular illustration. For a man that is above somebody else, above in a superficial sense, keep in mind, to be asking of somebody in a lower position materially for something. And I think the beauty that this proverb circles back to is, I think, what we are witnessing because of this irony, an expanse, an explosion of understanding of what the word poverty actually means. Because here we have because of the irony, keep in mind, the irony serves as this sort of sledgehammer or destructive force that breaks the superficial barrier. And because this barrier has been broken, beneath the shattered pieces of that superficiality we see and peer beneath, and we find a new distinction. It is no longer the rich man and the poor man. It is the man. And it is the man who is rich or poor. Rich that extends beyond, that extends to his soul. And for the one who has more in a material or superficial context, really only has more as a veneer, or in one aspect. But as we peer into it, we see something larger. We see something more pervasive. We see his moreness. We see his elevated status tucked away in a small corner of the room that is his dearth. And I say that sort of comedically, because the room, I think, is more than just his lacking. It is he as he is. The expression, a person's true colors, is such an interesting expression. That is, only after some event is somebody's true colors revealed. And by that meaning, it seems to suggest that what was at the surface, the color that was seen at the surface, was not what is beneath. Now, we do have this. And in a way, I think that what is revealed is this man's dearth. What we see is this man's poverty. Of course, it's more glaring to us because we had believed up until now that he was superior than our poor man. And yet he holds out his hand to the poor man. And we have to wonder what he's asking. We have to wonder if he even knows what he's asking. Perhaps he's asking for a return to the prior state of their relationship. That is, he will only accept once the poor man has returned himself to some standard by which this association was founded in the first place, and a return to the material goods that he can offer his friend. In such a case, of course, we are able to further see this man's poverty, because his lack of understanding, his lack of compassion, his lack of empathy, his lack of standard, his lack of uprightness. On the other hand, he could be asking, again, as the veneer of superficiality has broke, he could find himself asking, or I should say, so this person, now we are in the perspective of the person who has turned around, the person that has been caught by these words. The words might have reached him. Now this wanting may be a true wanting, because of that veneer, because it has been broken by those words of why do you leave? Who knows what the final straw was? Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was shame, judgment. What he is wanting in this instance is true. He is wanting of something that is deeper than that layer, that superficial layer, that their relationship was built on before. And perhaps in the first instance the man ran. Perhaps he didn't know that he ran because for this reason, but perhaps he ran because he was scared. He saw himself, the potential of himself in that situation. Perhaps he truly believed that the man, now that he had lost his status, is worth less than he. And because of the words, it has stirred up something in him of a revelation. And the hand that is now reaching forward, again, is asking for forgiveness, wanting of forgiveness. Surely that's a charitable interpretation. but it also depends on the quality of those words. A poor man, a man in a state of destitution, perhaps doesn't have the luxury of... I have to be careful here because I want to say that he doesn't have the luxury of inattentiveness. If he is a righteous man, he doesn't have that luxury. He doesn't distract himself with television. His problems are immediate. He has things to solve. And so the depth of these words may be quite intense. That judgment may be quite intense. The poor man has nothing to lose. And words under that condition, in that environment, can be quite sharp and true, and also beautiful. And it is possible that this situation was the thing that produced the key to unlock that person, that friend, that prior association. Now, in the latter instance, it is possible that the words appear wanting to him. Now, after that previous explanation, this explanation is probably going to seem dull. This interpretation, I should say. That is, the words that were used as the man says, wait, why are you doing this? I want this connection. Now that I'm poor, I have nothing. I need this. It is an extension of wanting. That poverty extends through him. And perhaps this is the impetus for the man to increase his distance farther from the poverty of this man. Of course, this is more of a negative view of it. I think all of these are possible. I think the one that we want is the one for the poor man to rise above his condition and to mold those words like the finest of jewelry, perhaps the finest of steel, and to wrap it around that person. And they together both ascend. They use this situation as an opportunity for transcendence rather than that of some unfortunate end. He that gets wisdom loves his own soul. He that keeps understanding shall find good. Now, I think going off of that last verse, I think it is a proper instruction, because there are many interpretations, but there are only a few in which man ought to consider if he was in a similar situation. Of the man that is in a state of poverty, I think like I said, it's an opportunity that affords him to reflect and to make decisions, better decisions, on what life has to offer, what faithfulness means, what it truly means. It's an opportunity to grow in one's faith. And I think that this is a form of wisdom. And the reception of this wisdom can no doubt be a good thing, and it can no doubt produce love for that soul. I'm reminded of a person that I had met recently, a person of modest means. He was a janitor, is a janitor, I think. And this person was the most positive person that I probably have ever met in my life. Some might say he was positive, joyous to a fault. I think it was too much for some people. But I saw in him a type of wisdom that one doesn't often come by. That he was somebody that truly rose above his situation, his condition. And I could tell that there was a point in his life that brought him absolutely to his knees. And he was a very faithful person. He is a very faithful person. And I couldn't help but tell him, I appreciate your demeanor, your joy. Now, if our man had, in the previous verse, if he had not kept to his devotion, and he had not welded his words to such a fine intersection, that it was strong and it was firm, if he had not held that understanding, and if he had not taken that opportunity, the good would not have come. Now, it's possible that his efforts may not have led to good in that particular situation anyway. The faith eventually certainly would, but the thing is that if he was resolute in his faith, and he took that opportunity, and in fact he took all such opportunities, even if one or two don't manifest, eventually one will choose to go with and to transcend to the next level, to reignite something that is deeper, it's more profound, it's better, it's good. And so that way, keeping understanding is holding on to, it's holding on to the opportunities that are given to self-reflect, to be discerning, to consider that point in the peak, that highest point, to look up when one is confronted with a problem, rather than to look down. A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall perish. Now this is strange. So we're on verse 9, but verse 5, a false witness shall not be unpunished. The same words, different only in the last. And he that speaks lies shall not escape. Verse 9, and he that speaks lies shall perish. There's a pattern here that I don't think is too common that I've seen so far in the Proverbs. I think we have a thread that is thrown through the verses here to connect. Now it's possible that the pattern is false, but the pattern of this verse appearing again is not false. And I think it deserves some time and consideration. Now I think in the last verse, in verse 5, again, a false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall not escape. If my memory serves me, I think I gave an analogy that was in line with that of the law, an illustration of sort of a courthouse. Because of the word witness. Now, though I can't remember exactly how I described it earlier on in this episode, I think that there probably was a degree of understanding in there that was beyond that of just the basic courthouse analogy, or of some person that is standing by, that sees something take place that would then later be argued in a court of law. Now the word witness, just like the word poverty, just like many words, I think, can be used and restrained based on a certain context, but also, or I should say more importantly, the word in and of itself has, now this might be a stretch, but in some sense it follows reason. That is to say that words such as these, that of poverty or of wisdom or of a witness, which we are talking about here, I think they have a hearth of their own. They have this centerpiece that is the orienting structure, the orienting pillar of meaning around which these words operate. Now, they can be afforded different contextual situations in which their meaning is restricted necessarily by certain boundaries, by certain events, perhaps by certain institutions. And that restriction in and of itself is not a negative thing. I think I discussed a little bit of this in regards or in relation to that of liberty and that of the political order of liberalism. Now, of this hearth that is at the center of many of our meaningful words, I think there is, I have to be judicious here because this is unexplored territory, and of course much of what this podcast is unexplored territory, but I don't want to make a false equivalence. I want something that could be tied together, something that can be followed. There's no leap. And so as I lay down this pillar into the dirt, this pillar that represents the hearth of witness, my mind reaches out and it attempts to grab that which it knows by previous association. It is considering that example that I had used about the hearth as it relates to man and his relationship to other people within his family, and how that hearth within the home really binds the family together, and how that scales. Again, this goes into that fractal discussion of how it scales all the way up into the level of the nation or the state. And I think on one hand it's useful to think about where exactly this hearth lies when we discuss language on this fractal continuum. It seems in one sense to be in the microcosm. It is within the mind of man. It is within his understanding. It is within that sort of that interface that language provides us. It provides us with something by which we can, it's really interesting, the fundamentals of language, of what it does for us, of what it does for our personalities, of the being, of ourselves. I have lived most of my life with this language within my head that I use to communicate with myself. It is a strange, like I said, it's a strange interface, but it's an interface nonetheless, meaning that it is the tool by which information is conveyed. It's the tool by which the self can orient itself, can make decisions, can solve problems. It is a way that the self can orients itself in relation to other people with the same language. And by extension, Plato comes to mind here, that culture, although this imperfect thing, is undoubtedly affected by the tool of language that we use. Culture, to some degree, dictates the form and the structure of the tools that we use. The individual also has the capacity to influence, to manipulate, to create their own tools, to make sense of things as they see fit. Now, of course, this may be a positive or a negative. That's not really the point that I'm after here. My main design at this point is to outline and to illustrate, to provide some reflection on how language surrounds the individual and how it surrounds the collective. And I had introduced and I had asked the question, where does our language, these words, where is the hearth of language, and thereby the extension, the individual words, where does that rest within that fractal structure? And of course, it's a fractal structure, so it should rest within the mind of man, just as it does at the pinnacle of our culture or our collective consciousness. But for now, obviously, we are focusing on the microcosm. This is one man speaking into a microphone. And so I'm considering the hearth of this witness. And the first thing that I would say, that it extends beyond the judicious. It extends beyond the legal institution. For a man can witness many things, and yet it is not a prerequisite that he must that in order to be a witness, he must serve a court. He must give his assessment and recount the things that he had seen. Now, the court analogy is useful, because although not every instance of witnessing has to do with that institution, the court as an institution can be overlaid as a similarity, as a parallel to that of the cosmic, of that of the divine courthouse, which is something that's represented as truth in totality. In some sense, it represents material law, but it also represents that that thing behind the curtain, that conscious entity and that conscious force, that creative force that has set into motion the laws by which the software of the human mind is able to run. And to access this software, to interface with that substructure that is beyond the self, it is in some sense that emergent quality that the human being, how should I say this, that emergent quality that gives rise to that level of consciousness, that level of perception, the integration of all those different components and neurological networks that somehow produce this sophisticated being that taps into something that is above what is beneath. Many things that he is lie beneath that which he considers himself to be. And by extension, the world that he finds himself in, the thing that, again, is that interface by which he communicates and makes sense of that substructure, is to some degree, not in totality, but to a degree, because not every experience of man has to do with his linguistic abilities. Man was man before the introduction of language, surely. But language is an important component. It is an important uptick. It's like a major software update or a major version of Windows, whereas the previous versions, perhaps the more primitive or crude ways that he is able to interface with the world has been expanded by his understanding and development of language. And it's not really that underlying substructure has changed all that much, but rather we can say that what has been done is an expansion of certain fundamentals. The same is true of, I think, that Windows operating system as it is with human being and language, and that of his cultural traditions, for that matter. So why does that matter? Well, we have to remind ourselves that we are talking about the hearth of language. Again, by extension, the hearth of the word witness. Now, we have made a parallel between that of man's law, that of the law of nature, and that of the law of the divine. And in the spirit of this fractal nature, our fractal representation of reality, it is, in proper situations, for the above to meet the below in alignment. If it is the case that our government has committed certain sins that are outside of the wish and the desires of its people, and it continues to do so, and it continues to disorient its body, such that it begins to separate itself from the rest of man, and it is no longer an extension of his will, but rather an extension of some selfish desire of a few, what we find ourselves in is a disunity. Now, this space, I think, is a bit difficult for me because of the different possibilities of, the reasons why man can find himself at a pivotal point, at a, what is the word that's commonly used for these sorts of things? It's perhaps axiomatic, it's that pivot point, it's a kairos. Whatever we want to call it. These moments, I think, are marked by a profound realization, an illumination of something. Now, it can be good, it can be bad. It's hard to say with the human being and the human race. Just as it's difficult to manage this, to understand this capital L liberal society. We are all sort of on this journey together. We are all marching up the mountain. Inevitably, we are going to make a mistake. Perhaps we find ourselves moving horizontally or even on a descent rather than moving up to where we find ourselves closer to that unity, that divine source, that understanding. Perhaps we misjudge the sacrifices that are necessary. And perhaps it's not out of wickedness, although it may have similar consequences to that of wicked behavior. A missed opportunity can have unavoidable downstream consequences, and it can affect man's transcendence up that stairway to heaven, if you will. And I promise that I'll get to some point here. But it's going to take a while, and I think I'm moving in that direction. I hope it's visible or audible. So part of this is going to have to do with finishing this road that we are on, and then the tying together of certain verses, and then finally tying together verse 9, which is the verse that we are on. A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall perish. This all has to be integrated, so it'll take some time. So, as I was saying, the hearth of witness. If I can say so, the hearth of witness is not witness itself, but it is the place around which witness is bound. And so that might seem kind of strange. but it involves the gathering place of the human mind to contribute this witness, to the word itself. So in some sense, the hearth is witness, in the sense that it is the place around which we discuss the meaning of witness, but it is not witness itself because it requires the interaction of those who come to sit around it, to dance around it, to sing around it, to converse around it, that causes it to be. So it's sort of a dynamic thing, and I think that this is something that is not entirely outside of any reasonable understanding of what our culture is. There's a lot of give and take in culture. There is change over time linguistically. If we just think about the English language, Old English is very difficult to recognize if we go far back enough. And even within our own lifetimes, there has been the introduction of new words. There has been the disuse of some old words. There has been modification of other words. Culture has a lot to do with how we perceive language and how we use it. So here is our first step, or perhaps it's our second step, or our third. For in the first instance, we understand that witness is beyond that of any one particular illustration, that there is something fundamental about it that we can say is equivalent to that of the hearth that is this fireplace within a home that binds a family together, around which they commune, they share experiences, and that bond is strengthened. We extend this analogy to that of language in general and to that of specific words such as witness. Now, of witness, having a hearth of its own, it is a dynamic force. Its hearth binds, and within its symbolic purpose, that binding, that capacity that it has to bind and to bring people around it to discuss its meaning and to contribute to its life, its form, we can say. I think this conception is the thing that we must understand moving forward. Now, I'm sure that there are other ways to understand this word and language in general. Just as, again, in the analogy of the mountain. The mountain at its base is quite large. It's massive. One man may start at one place and be entirely unaware of a large mass of people that have started at a different place and started ascending that mountain again in a different location. And yet they both ascend together. They both have their own journeys. But insofar as my journey is concerned, this hearth, and again, I should say that this is not a philosophy of relativism. This is to say, much like the hearth and its dynamic process, it has solidity to it. It is something. There is variability. But man's mind is variable. His perception of the world is not perfect. That's why he remains humble. But given the constraints, given those axioms, we understand his limitations, and thereby in order such that we may come to a deeper truth, I think it is necessary to understand the way in which our software is moved, the way it is shaped, our software or our interface. Perhaps I've been using this interface analogy. How this interface is manipulated, how the different buttons are placed in different places, all the different features. It's important for us to understand this interface. The better we understand it, the better we can interface with it. And we are interfacing on the other side with the thing that is reality. It's not we are sort of the computer, and what we are interfacing with is the conscious being, with God. And I suppose as a potential case for immortality of mind, we can think of our experiences as that little node of memory that is not understood by us as individuals, because much like, again, remember the fractal structure, much like the substructure that I talked about, that we are much unaware of, we, to a degree, provide some substructure, but also extension, like a peripheral joint receptor or something that is designed to perceive, to take in specific types of information, whether it be pressure, vibration, tissue stretch, or rate of tissue stretch, whatever it is, and send that information to the brain. We are sort of, to a degree, like this. Now, it's not a perfect analogy. Of course, there's some contradiction or inconsistencies between we being the computer and the conscious being that is interfacing through that computer. But certainly, as we hear about cases of judgment, we hear about cases of immortality, our experience and our behavior, given the context, given the hearth, perhaps, of man's perception. It's another interesting topic, I suppose. And just like language, as it has this sort of dynamism to it, man's perception, his experience, his existence, has this sort of strange dynamism to it. I think that ending point, that the degree to which he is integrated, the degree to which he is aligned in unity, what he has done in life, somehow, in some way, is remembered. It is perceived, it is processed. It is judged, perhaps we can say, in our language. Exactly how that looks, I have no idea. But this is an axiom, an extension of certain axioms that we arrive to. Now, I think all of this is necessary so that we can place witness in its proper place, so we could place it within the rest of the verses that have occurred, so we can recognize the pattern between verse 5 and verse 9. There's 4 verses that led up to verse 5. There are a few that led up to verse 9. And I think perhaps this is my first time realizing it, or perhaps this is the first time it's happening, but it's probably the first time that I'm realizing it. I think I felt inklings of it before in the Proverbs, that there are patterns within patterns, and it's not just singular verses. Of course, there are certain chapters where it's quite explicit that there is a logical through line between different verses. Many of the chapters thus far I have failed, I think, to identify the pattern, but there have been a few where I've identified a larger pattern that is representative of the chapter, let alone from the individual verses that have patterns within them. The patterns within the individual are quite expansive and quite interesting, and that's sort of the approach in the reading that I've taken so far. But now, as I've gotten some experience here, and I've gained 19 chapters worth, or 18 chapters worth of experience, and now into the 19th, I can see that there's a possibility of a new way of reading it, of going back and going through it again at some point. That is, trying to see the pattern that is above that pattern, if there is one. So, that being said, what we are trying to do here is to see the pattern above that pattern that is within. We are examining the macrocosm. We are finding ourselves within the micro, expanding out again into the macro. We are doing this over and over and over again, and hopefully as we do so, our frequency begins to center around a point. And as we bounce back and forth, we get closer and closer to some logos, to some center point, around which we will have gained some understanding. Okay. So now where are we? We find ourselves at the hearth of witness. And I come to this hearth with my own experience. What can I say of witness? Now I know that I'm not alone around this hearth. But as it stands now, the time of day, and the circumstance, I find myself in communion with nothing else, nothing other than myself and this hearth. And so I've come to, perhaps, give a degree of sacrifice. Perhaps we can say that this word is an altar in which I am attempting to communicate with that divine spirit, that orienting spirit that allows this type of experience to be had, that allows us to integrate our perception and our experience, our conscious experience, into language, however bizarre that might be. It would only be bizarre to another being of equal intelligence that does not use language, perhaps. But nonetheless, I find myself here in front of this hearth of witness. I am a person that sees. I am an observer. I am a gatherer of that which is perceivable. I watch and I take note. I validate. I know by my memory of certain experiences that have taken place. I can understand my life by the experiences that I've had, and by that evidence around which I know my experience to be true. There is plenty that I can attest to. There's plenty that I can openly profess to. Perhaps it's difficult for me to claim to know, but I can claim to believe that my experience is real, and that what I see is real. And though I may be mistaken, at certain points, I may realize my falsehood, I nonetheless am an active participant in the witness of life and experience. Not only am I a witness to my own experience, but I am a witness to that which lies outside of myself. I see that which is. Again, I may be mistaken. And yet within the belief that there is something that can be witnessed, perhaps that ought to be witnessed, I try, although imperfectly, to be a good witness, to be a good observer, to be a good experiencer. to give justice to this hearth that is witness. So this marks the end to part 1 of my commentary on chapter 19. I'll continue next time with verse 9, and trying my best to weave what we have discussed thus far into something that is more solid. It integrates the verses that we have seen